Welcome to our discussion on early federalism, including the Marshall Court, dual federalism, and cooperative federalism. These are the topics for our discussion. What role did John Marshall play in this federal relationship? What is dual federalism? And what is cooperative federalism? And we will discuss both of these types of federalism in 2 and 3 there, dual and cooperative federalism, by making analogies to cake. So let's get started with the first one, federalism and the Marshall Court. So the nature of power allocation between the national and the state governments has changed dramatically. The debate continues today and will continue into the future. And the changes in the relationship between the national and the state governments, those changes are largely due to Supreme Court rulings. But it wasn't always that way with the Supreme Court. In the first few years of the court's existence, it was seen as weak. It heard very few cases, and oftentimes it was hard to get people who would agree to become a justice to the High Court. This all changed, though, with the appointment of John Marshall as Chief Justice. The Marshall Court, the Supreme Court at the time when John Marshall was Chief Justice, made a few key decisions that defined the nature of the state and national relationship. Perhaps the biggest example is the court case McCulloch v. Maryland. The Supreme Court upheld the power of the national government and denied the right of a state to tax the national bank. The court interpreted broadly the necessary and proper clause, and that paved the way in the future for later rulings that would uphold expansive federal powers. So here's a little bit of background information about the court case. In 1816, Congress chartered the Second Bank of the United States. The charter for the first had been allowed to expire. So in 1818, the Maryland State Legislature levied a tax requiring all banks not chartered by Maryland, so basically the national bank, the Second National Bank of the United States, to buy stamp paper from Maryland on which the banknotes would be issued, or pay $15,000 a year, or go out of business. So James McCulloch was the head cashier of the Baltimore branch of the Second Bank of the U.S. and refused to pay Maryland what Maryland was demanding. So Maryland brought suit. The Maryland State Court ruled in favor of Maryland. McCulloch appealed to the Supreme Court. The U.S. Secretary of the Treasury made him. And in a unanimous opinion, the court ruled in favor of McCulloch. The national bank could be justified through the implied powers of the central government. So that's key question 1 there. Does Congress have the authority to charter a bank? Yes, because that is a proper reading of the necessary and proper clause. And then key question 2, if the bank is legitimate, can a state tax the bank? And the answer is no, because of the supremacy clause. National law is supreme. The state tax violated the supremacy clause. So this decision has major consequences today. The necessary and proper clause, which was used to justify the bank, has been used to justify federal action in many areas like education and health and welfare. You could even say that this decision, which the court is clearly laying out the supremacy of the national government over the states, this decision perhaps led to a decision that would ultimately be tested on the battlefields of the American Civil War. So that McCulloch v. Maryland is a huge Supreme Court case under the Marshall Court that clearly states the power structure between the national and the state governments under federalism. Next one gets a little bit tricky. It's called Gibbons v. Ogden from 1824. The Supreme Court upheld the broad congressional power to regulate interstate commerce. That's a very important one. It gave the national government the power to regulate interstate commerce. And that means that in the future, broad, expansive federal powers have been upheld. This gets a little bit tricky in the details, but Robert Fulton was granted exclusive rights to operate steamboats on the Hudson River by the New York State Legislature. At the same time, Congress licensed the ship to sail on the same waters. By the time the case reached the court, the details get very complicated. Essentially, New York and New Jersey wanted to control shipping on the lower Hudson. The key question here is, what is the scope of Congress's authority under the Commerce Clause? The states argued it should be interpreted narrowly to include only direct dealings in products. But the court ruled that under its power to regulate commerce, interstate commerce, Congress could regulate commercial activity, and the commerce power basically had no limits except those specifically found in the Constitution. New York could not grant a monopoly to a single operator because it interfered with interstate commerce. And today, the Commerce Clause is used to justify a great deal of federal legislation, including legislation over highways and stock markets and segregation. So Congress's ability to regulate interstate commerce is an enumerated power. It is specifically stated in the Constitution, but the interpretation of Congress's ability to regulate interstate commerce has been used to expand the size and the scope of the federal government. Congress uses this provision more than any other to justify its regulations. Two huge John Marshall court decisions. So you have Gibbons versus Ogden, you have McCulloch versus Maryland, and then the earlier court case of Marbury versus Madison. Now this transitions into an era called dual federalism. So despite the McCulloch and Gibbons decisions, the debate over national versus state power continued, not surprisingly. Roger Taney is John Marshall's successor as Chief Justice. He serves from 1835 to 1863. He advanced this thing called dual federalism, which is also called concurrent power, concurrent federalism. This belief that having separate and equally powerful levels of government is the best arrangement. The argument is that the national government should not exceed its enumerated power, and since the 10th Amendment says so, all other powers are and should be reserved to the states and to the people. And this idea of dual federalism was being developed at the same time that slavery was being debated around the country. So there were questions about ownership, the status of fugitive slaves, and slavery in the new territories. Up until that point, the Supreme Court had generally decided in favor of slavery and states' rights within the framework of dual federalism. And here's a good example in the Dred Scott decision. So the Dred Scott versus Sanford case, 1857. This was a test case seeking Dred Scott's freedom. Scott had lived in Illinois, Wisconsin, and then New York. So the question was, did living in free states make Scott free? The court said slaves were never thought of or spoken of except as property, and it declared the Missouri Compromise to be unconstitutional, saying Congress could not ban slavery in the new territories. It narrowed the scope of national power and enhanced that of states, because it left the decision of whether or not slavery was going to be practiced in new states up to the states. It ruled out any sort of nationally legislated solution to slavery. It left the issue to the state legislatures, and a lot of scholars say that this probably hastened the Civil War. It probably made the Civil War happen more quickly. So, looking at the aftermath of the Civil War and the continuation of dual federalism, the federal government grew in power after the Civil War. It attempted to impose its will on state governments through amendments, the Civil War amendments, like the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments. The 13th Amendment essentially abolished slavery. The 14th is a lot more complicated, but basically it dealt with equal rights and civil rights and due process for blacks, for African Americans, and then 15th was suffrage for blacks, the right to vote. However, the Supreme Court continued dual federalism. So, despite the growth of national power with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, At the same time, the Supreme Court was making decisions that set up roughly equally powerful national and state governments. So state power was not diminished at the same time. The court upheld any law passed under states' police powers, laws passed by states to protect the general welfare of its citizens, and a big court case that exemplifies this is Plessy versus Ferguson, where the court ruled, despite the Civil War amendments, the court ruled that separate but equal facilities were constitutional. So the Supreme Court says, despite the Civil War amendments, most civil rights and voting cases were going to be addressed by the states. Now we're going to look at a transition into a stronger national government. 2 amendments altered the relationship between national and state governments. The 16th Amendment, which enacted a national income tax, had been found unconstitutional in 1895. This gave the federal government access to almost unlimited revenue, so now the national government is very powerful. And if money is power, the federal government is now very powerful. They could enter policy areas now where the national government previously had little funds to spend. And then the 17th Amendment, where the election of senators was taken out of the hands of the state legislatures and put into the hands of the people. So the people directly voted for the senators, whereas before it was the state legislatures that selected that state's 2 senators to the national government. So this gave the national government more power at the expense of the states because the states were no longer making the decision. The states lost their principal protectors in Congress because senators were no longer accountable to the states, but to the people. And then we enter an area called cooperative federalism. So dual federalism ends in the 1930s, and the New Deal brings in this era called cooperative federalism. So with the New Deal, which is based the years 1933 to 1939, faced with rampant unemployment, 40 to 50%, FDR created a variety of innovative programs under the heading of the New Deal. So FDR had to use his whole range of skills and leadership, and this remarkably changed the scope and the role of the national government and the relationship between each state and the national government. So in order to reach a national solution to the Great Depression, the national government would have to exercise tremendous authority. As soon as FDR was inaugurated, Congress passed a series of acts creating new agencies and programs proposed by the president. This has been deemed an alphabetocracy, a rule by the alphabet. Here are some examples. You got the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, which provided federal funding for new home construction. The Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, which was a work relief program. The Agricultural Adjustment Act imposed restrictions on production in agriculture. The National Recovery Act imposed restrictions on production in certain industries. These programs greatly increased national power and were challenged in the Supreme Court almost immediately. And at least at first, the court often ruled that they were unconstitutional. At that point, the court had a laissez-faire approach, or a hands-off take on the economy, implying that the best way to regulate the economy was to get the government out of the economy, to take a hands-off approach to the economy. The unconstitutional rulings from the court irritated FDR and Congress. FDR wanted to pack the court, which would mean expanding it from 9 to 13 justices, and those extra 4 would be appointed by him, so that would give him a majority on the court. It never happened. The idea of it sparked outrage in Congress and in the public, but it didn't really matter anyway because the Supreme Court did start to reverse many of its earlier anti-national government stances in 1937. So FDR and Congress got broad powers in commerce. They did things like maximum hour laws, minimum hour laws, minimum wage laws, child labor. The court upheld the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, which authorized collective bargaining amongst labor unions and employees. So these programs forced all levels of government to work together. Local governments, city governments, national governments were seen as equal partners. In some cases, states were left out of the process because they usually underrepresented urban interests. So that takes us into what cooperative federalism is, and this analogy with cake. So before the New Deal, the type of federalism, dual federalism, is called layer cake federalism, where each layer of government has clearly defined powers and responsibilities, and they're roughly equal, the states and the national government. But after the New Deal, the metaphor is now a marble cake federalism, which is an inseparable mixture of differently colored ingredients. So that would be the different levels of government, the national, the state, and the local governments. It's called cooperative federalism. There's an intertwined relationship between national, state, and local governments that began with the New Deal. Alright, that takes us to the end of the Marshall Court, dual federalism, and cooperative federalism, and also layer cake and marble cake federalism. Hope it helped, and good luck studying.